I think one of the toughest things to do when writing a mystery thriller type show like Severance is keeping the mystery going in a way that is both satisfying and intriguing. You want your audience to stay hooked and interested, and to want to see and know more. However, you also have to do it in a way that doesn't strain their patience or leave them unsatisfied. Conceal too much, and you risk alienating your audience or leaving them too confused to care. Reveal too much, and you break the intrigue, dissolving the novelty that made such a show so interesting in the first place. It was definitely a hard balance to achieve, but I think Season 2 of Severance managed it masterfully. Only a section of this video will have spoilers, and I'll warn you about it beforehand. But for now, without going into spoilers, I believe this season made for an excellent continuation to the story. On the one hand, its 10-episode run felt a little weird with its pacing, and took some detours in places that felt like they slowed down the flow of the story. In any other show, I might have had a bigger issue with it, and for a few episodes it did start to bother me a little here. But when the season came to a close, I realized that it tied together perfectly, and that it had managed to stay solidly interconnected. When the show broke up the flow of the main story, it did so for good reason, and it was to further build its world. Worldbuilding has always been a particularly impressive aspect of this show for me, mostly in regards to developing the history of Lumen as this mega corporation and its influence on the world. In this season, we learn more about that history and about the weird culty Egans. We also see how Harmony Cobell ties into that world, and how far back this company predates, and some of its many other weird crimes that date far back before the Severance procedure. Most interesting to me is that we also get to see a little of how something like Severance fits into the real world, as in the real world as we know it in real life. For example, we get a scene where we learn a little bit about the church's stance on Severance, and the role that faith plays in it, and the opinion religion has on severed individuals and what their afterlife would look like. All of this and more were part of the show's fantastic world building, crafting a light-ish sci-fi setting that is still so close to our real world that it remains very believable. And due to that valuable world building and how essentially it tied into the story, I didn't mind that the pacing got a teensy bit wonky sometimes in order to give us more of it. I also have to mention that I did feel like pacing-wise, this season felt more action-packed and gripping, especially nearer to the first half compared to Season 1. Season 1 had a slow start while it established everything, but I felt like Season 2 managed to jump into the action quicker. Pacing aside, while the season's overarching plot serves to slightly unravel some of the main questions we had from Season 1, such as what the deal was with Gemma/Miss Casey, and what Cold Harbor and the refining project was all about, it also served to explore some fascinating new character arcs for the main cast. This season has a lot more of the macro data refinement crew's outies, and that effectively adds a whole new cast of characters. But the show does well to balance both sides, giving enough time for the in-office innies and the real outside lives of the outies. And it's most interesting when those two connect, because in this season we do get a lot of that, especially in regards to Mark. And we get to see just how separate these severed identities are. We get a bigger feel for their own individuality and how they really truly constitute distinct identities of their own. How they're so separated that one could be so jealous of the other or completely despise the other. And it's such an eerie, surreal concept, as it has been from Season 1, to see an innie, Mark for example, have to consider his own mortality, that being his severed existence. It's such an interesting thing to consider, how these innies fear reintegration, or just their outies quitting this job in general, because for them it means death. It's effectively them grappling with their own mortality and just being afraid to die, which humanizes them even further, but in a way that is very odd when you take the whole Severance situation into consideration. Even the non-severed characters get their time in the spotlight. Mr. Milchik was probably my favorite character in this season, and the journey that he starts to undergo here is very interesting and really makes you want to see more of the character. This season's additions make him one of the most interesting, complex characters in the show, and Tramell Tillman is charismatic as hell in the role. The dude is simply magnetic and really keeps you glued to the screen every scene he's in. Another thing I really enjoyed about this season was how it went even harder with the creative environments and set designs. We got to see the crew in new, visually interesting places, and broke up the monotony of the severed floor by exploring new, wildly different areas. In a way, this ties back into the world building, with more of Lumen and its many departments being unveiled. but it also serves to highlight the series continuing to be very visually striking and massively creative in how it continues to bring life, mystery, and originality into the mind-numbingly corporate halls of Lumen. Despite my overall love for the show and the season, there were still some things that I found a little weird and could have been done better. I'm going to be getting into some spoilers here, so if you want to skip this section, then go to the timestamp up on screen now. Okay, so there were a few things that I did not like in this season, that I didn't feel made a lot of sense story-wise, or that felt a little off. The first is in regards to Irving. This season served to make me love and appreciate this character even more, but there was one event that felt off, and it's his discovery of Helly's betrayal. In the Ortbo episode, Irving realizes that Helly is not in fact Helly, but rather her outie Helena Egan, and he threatens to drown her unless Milchick reactivates Helly. The way he comes to this realization is after she repeatedly refuses to tell them what she did in the real world during the overtime contingency protocol, and after she ends up being cruel to him when he questions her about it. Irving claims that Helly was never cruel, and that's basically how he found out. Now, all that is well and good and reasonably believable, but what's not believable is the massive leap of thought he makes to surmise that in order for her to be able to pretend to be her innie, she must be an Egan. I think it's too far a leap, and while it makes sense for him to consider that she's someone of means and power in the Lumen world, given her doing this, it's too far-fetched for him to be able to deduce that she's an Egan, especially given that Innie Irving has no knowledge of Helena or anything that could imply that it's her. If anything, it's less likely for Egans to be severing one of their own. This is what makes the Helena reveal so crazy at the end of Season 1. All of this may somehow tie into Irving's Audie's motivations and his secret phone booth conversations somehow, but still, Innie Irving is severed and so presumably is unconnected to all that. After this happened, I was also frustrated with the fact that it seemed like we never got Mark and Dylan actually learning the full story of what Helly had seen during the OTC. It's very crucial information that they all should know, but I don't feel like it was well established that they ended up discussing it. At first, Mark straight up avoids hearing about it from Helly because he's having a phase of despair and giving up on fighting the ever-knowledgeable Lumen. But even after he's over that, we don't get any concrete indication that this was discussed, when I firmly believe we should have, because it could tie greatly into the crew's plans to overthrow Lumen from the inside, and perhaps help them in understanding Lumen's general motivation with Severance by factoring in the information Helly obtained about the Senator and his wife severing during childbirth and whatnot. Another plot thread that frustrated me was Dylan's storyline in the last few episodes. In isolation, I enjoyed it, him quarreling with his Audi over the woman they both love. But what I didn't like was how it remained a bit isolated from Mark and Helly. I also felt like the season should have culminated in the three re-synchronizing on everything and being on the same page. Instead, we don't get to see Mark or Helly address Dylan's quitting/suicide attempt. These people spend up to 8-9 hours every day together and are very close, so it doesn't seem at all feasible or realistic for them to have hidden so much from each other. One way or another, they would have found out about Dylan, or he would have shared more, and it's frustrating that we didn't see it happen. And though the season finale had him come back to help Helly keep Mr. Milchick from chasing after Mark while Mark saved Gemma, it still felt like his character arc wasn't appropriately tied back into the main flow of things. My final issue with this season was how the reconnection with Cobell happened. I don't like how easily Dr. Ragabi was cast to the wayside, first by Devon and then by Mark, who seemed to forget her existence after he woke up. The reintegration process had already started, so she was a vital ally to keep on their side, given that she was the only one capable of trying to keep Mark alive and well, even if she were not to continue with the reintegration. Besides, Mark was on board with this plan, but when he awoke to find Ragabi gone, he didn't really push back against Devon for it. It felt like a weak way to get rid of such a crucial and badass character like Ragabi. It also weakens the whole reintegration plot thread, which the showrunners already seem to not have fully gone through with. After this, it felt like reintegration was just fully abandoned before it could even come to pass. It's also weird to me that Devon considered contacting Cobell at all. She was the floor manager who'd seeped into Mark's Audi's life, who'd posed a threat to Devon's own child, who did countless terrible boundary-breaking things, and yet Devon seemed convinced that she could help. It just didn't make sense to me for her to trust her after all that was done, and for Mark to be so okay with that. Granted, Mark does end up having second thoughts, but it's only after they actually meet her and have told her everything, and he throws a tantrum about how she can't be trusted. But it feels strange that it took him this long, and that he went from being completely neutral on the matter to completely against it, which I think should have been his instinct from the beginning. It felt like a weak way to reintegrate Cobell into the story. It felt a bit too forced and unnatural. But yeah, those plot points aside, I think season 2 of Severance was phenomenal. I don't know if it beat out season 1 for me personally. The novelty was still fresh with that one, and I do think that the first season's finale is almost too perfect to match. But season 2 did an amazing job nevertheless, and it managed to offer us the perfect blend of exposition and mystery, satiating enough of our appetites to keep us hooked for the next season without overshowing the showrunner's hand. It's not an easy thing to do, but Dan Erickson's writing and Ben Stiller's directing seem to really synchronize very well. Severance continues to be a very well-written show that is simultaneously very visually appealing, possessing both content and form. Thank you for watching. Let me know how you felt about the season in the comments below. If you haven't seen Severance yet, then please do. It's possibly the best show I've seen since maybe Succession. But anyways, take care for now, and I'll see you soon. Goodbye.